In the archives of the Newport Historical Society, criminal historian Dr. Robert Hayes was examining a collection of Gilded Age wedding photographs when he discovered an image that would lead him into one of the most chilling cases of the early 20th century. The formal wedding portrait, dated June 15, 1905, showed what appeared to be the epitome of American high society, elegance and happiness. The photograph captured the wedding of Miss Charlotte Vandermeer, daughter of railroad magnate William Vandermeer, to Mr. Charles Whitmore, a distinguished gentleman who had recently arrived in Newport society with impressive credentials and impeccable manners. The bride, radiant in an elaborate white silk gown with intricate beadwork and a cathedral-length veil, gazed adoringly at her new husband with the joy of a woman who believed she had found her perfect match. The groom appeared every inch the successful businessman and devoted husband. Charles Whitmore was impeccably dressed in morning coat and striped trousers, his dark hair perfectly styled, and his handsome features arranged in an expression of confident satisfaction. Everything about his appearance suggested refinement, education, and the kind of breeding that Newport's elite families demanded in their social circle. The setting itself spoke of tremendous wealth and social position. The ceremony had taken place at the Vandermeer family's oceanfront mansion, with the reception held in elaborate gardens overlooking the Atlantic. The wedding had been covered extensively in society newspapers, with journalists describing it as one of the most magnificent celebrations of the 1905 social season. However, as Dr. Hayes examined the photograph under magnification, something caught his attention that transformed this image of marital bliss into something far more sinister. The groom's left hand, which rested on his bride's waist in a gesture of affection and possession, bore distinctive scarring across the knuckles and back of the hand, marks that were barely visible in the formal portrait, but became unmistakable under closer inspection. The scarring pattern was familiar to Dr. Hayes, who had spent decades studying historical crime photographs and evidence. These were not the random marks of accident or injury, but rather the deliberate scars that certain types of criminals used as identification markers, or that resulted from specific types of violence. The positioning and regularity of the marks suggested they had been created intentionally, possibly as part of gang identification or as the result of repeated violent encounters. What made this discovery particularly disturbing was the contrast between Charles Whitmore's refined appearance and social standing and the evidence of a violent past literally written on his flesh. The photograph that had been intended to document the joy of a perfect society wedding had inadvertently preserved evidence of what Dr. Hayes suspected might be one of the most successful criminal deceptions in American history. To understand the significance of Charles Whitmore's successful infiltration of Newport society, Dr. Hayes immersed himself in research about the exclusive world of America's wealthiest families during the height of the Gilded Age. Newport in 905 represented the pinnacle of American social achievement, where acceptance required not just enormous wealth, but also impeccable breeding and social connections that could be traced back generations. The Vandermeer family had been part of Newport's inner circle since the 1870s, when William Vandermeer had established himself as one of the most successful railroad entrepreneurs in the country. His fortune, estimated at over $50 million by 1905, had purchased not just a magnificent oceanfront estate, but also the social standing that made his daughter Charlotte one of the most sought-after brides in American society. Newport's social season of 1905 had been particularly competitive, with wealthy families from New York, Boston, and Philadelphia competing to display their prosperity through elaborate parties, charitable events, and strategic marriages. The pressure to maintain social position meant that families were constantly seeking to align themselves with others of equal or superior status, making them vulnerable to individuals who could successfully impersonate members of their class. Dr. Hayes's research revealed that Charles Whitmore had appeared in Newport society during the summer of 1904, introducing himself as a recent Harvard graduate who had inherited substantial mining interests in Colorado. His credentials had seemed impeccable. He possessed extensive knowledge of literature and art, spoke several languages fluently, and demonstrated the kind of cultural refinement that wealthy families expected in their social circle. Most importantly, Charles had presented himself as a man of independent means who was seeking marriage for love rather than financial advantage. This appealed to families, like the Vandermeers, who had grown weary of fortune hunters and were looking for a son-in-law who could contribute to rather than drain their wealth. The courtship between Charles and Charlotte had been conducted according to the strict social protocols of the era, with supervised meetings, formal chaperoned outings, and extensive interaction between the families. William Vandermeer had conducted what he believed to be thorough background investigations into Charles' claims about his education and financial resources, but these inquiries had been limited by the communication, technology, and record-keeping systems of the early 1900 eyes as Charles' success in deceiving Newport society represented a remarkable achievement in criminal deception. suggesting either exceptional intelligence and preparation or extensive experience in assuming false identities among wealthy social circles. Dr. Hayes consulted with Dr. Maria Santos, a forensic pathologist who specialized in historical wound analysis, to understand the significance of the scarring visible on Charles Whitmore's hand in the wedding photograph. Using digital enhancement techniques, they were able to examine the markings in detail and develop theories about their origin and meaning. These scars show a very specific pattern. Dr. Santos explained after studying high-resolution scans of the photograph. The marks across the knuckles appear to be defensive wounds, the type you see when someone has been involved in repeated hand-to-hand combat. But the regular scarring on the back of the hand looks more deliberate, possibly self-inflicted, or created as part of some kind of ritual or identification system. The scarring pattern consisted of several elements that each told part of a disturbing story. Across the knuckles of Charles' left hand were multiple small scars consistent with repeated fighting, suggesting someone who had been involved in numerous violent confrontations. These marks were typically found on professional criminals, gang members, or individuals who had spent time in violent environments, such as prisons. More intriguingly, the back of Charles's hand bore 3 parallel lines of scarring that appeared to have been created with a sharp blade in a deliberate pattern. Dr. Santos noted that similar markings had been documented among criminal organizations of the late 19th century, particularly those operating in major cities, where gang identification was important for both protection and intimidation purposes. The combination of defensive fighting scars and deliberate identification markings suggested that Charles Whitmore had not only been involved in criminal activity, but had likely held a significant position within an organized criminal group. The skill required to completely hide these marks during normal social interaction indicated someone with extensive experience in concealing evidence of his violent past. Dr. Hayes's investigation into criminal identification practices of the early 1900s revealed that the 3-line scarring pattern was associated with several notorious criminal organizations operating in New York, Chicago, and Boston during the 1890s. These groups had used scarification as a way to identify members and indicate rank within their organizations. Most disturbing was the discovery that this particular scarring pattern had been linked to criminals involved in what law enforcement of the era called murder for hire, professional killers who targeted wealthy individuals for robbery or elimination. The marking served both as identification among criminal associates and as a badge of achievement for successful violent crimes. The evidence suggested that Charles Whitmore was not simply a con man seeking to marry into wealth, but potentially a professional killer who had assumed a false identity to gain access to victims among America's wealthiest families. Dr. Hayes's investigation into Charles Whitmore's background revealed a masterfully constructed false identity that had been designed to withstand the scrutiny of wealthy families while providing access to potential victims. The depth and sophistication of the deception suggested someone with extensive experience in criminal enterprises and identity fraud. Harvard University records from 1934 contain no enrollment information for anyone named Charles Whitmore matching the description of Charlotte's husband. More significantly, the university's alumni office had no record of issuing transcripts or providing references for any Charles Whitmore during the period when he would have been establishing his credentials in Newport society. The mining interests in Colorado that Charles claimed to own proved to be equally fictional. County records in Denver and surrounding areas showed no property ownership, business licenses, or tax payments associated with Charles Whitmore or any similar name during the relevant time period. The detailed knowledge of mining, operations that Charles had demonstrated in conversations with potential business partners, appeared to have been acquired through research rather than actual experience. Dr. Hayes's breakthrough came when he discovered that several elements of Charles's fabricated background corresponded exactly to the genuine biography of Charles Whitman, a Harvard graduate who had died in a mining accident in Colorado in 1903. The real Charles Whitman had been the son of a wealthy Boston family, had graduated from Harvard with honors, and had inherited substantial mining properties that were still being operated by his estate. The similarity in names was not coincidental. The criminal who became Charles Whitmore had apparently studied newspaper accounts of Whitman's death and had systematically appropriated elements of his biography to create a believable false identity. This required extensive research and careful planning, suggesting that the deception had been in development for months or possibly years before Charles appeared in Newport society. Most chilling was the discovery that Charles Whitman's body had never been recovered from the mining accident, which had officially been attributed to a cave-in at a remote mine site. The lack of physical remains meant that no one could definitively prove that Charles Whitman was dead, providing perfect cover for someone who had assumed his identity. Evidence suggested that the man who married Charlotte Vandermeer was a professional criminal who had either killed the real Charles Whitman or had discovered his death and opportunistically assumed his identity as part of a long-term criminal plan targeting wealthy families. As Dr. Hayes investigated deeper into the criminal background that Charles Whitmore's scars suggested, he discovered a disturbing pattern of wealthy women who had mysteriously disappeared or died under suspicious circumstances in cities where someone matching Charles's description had been active during the late 1890s and early 1900s police. Records from New York, Boston, and Philadelphia contained reports of several cases involving wealthy women who had vanished after meeting mysterious suitors who claimed to be from prominent families. The pattern was consistent. A charming, well-educated man would appear in high society circles, court a wealthy woman with substantial inheritance or family fortune, and then both would disappear after a brief marriage or engagement. The most significant case had occurred in Boston in 1902, where Mrs. Eleanor Ashworth, widow of a prominent banker, had married a man calling himself Charles Whitman after a whirlwind courtship. Mrs. Ashworth had liquidated substantial investments to provide her new husband with capital for business ventures, then had vanished along with him and her fortune 6 weeks after their wedding. Boston police had investigated the disappearance, but had been unable to locate either Mrs. Ashworth or her husband. The case had eventually been closed when investigators concluded that the couple had likely eloped to Europe with her money, though Mrs. Ashworth's family had insisted that she would never have abandoned her children and grandchildren voluntarily. Similar cases in New York and Philadelphia showed the same pattern. Wealthy women meeting charming strangers who claimed impeccable credentials, rapid courtships leading to marriage or engagement, liquidation of the women's assets, and then mysterious disappearances of both parties. In each case, local police had assumed that the couples had fled together, despite family members' insistence that the women's behavior was completely out of character. Dr. Hayes' analysis of these cases revealed that the mysterious men in each incident had used variations of the same false identity, elements that Charles Whitmore had employed in Newport. The Harvard education, Colorado mining interests, and family background details appeared in multiple cases with minor variations that suggested a single individual perfecting his deception over time. Most disturbing was the discovery that none of the missing women had ever been heard from again, despite extensive family efforts to locate them. The pattern suggested that Charles Whitmore was not simply a con man seeking to steal from wealthy women, but potentially a serial killer who eliminated his victims after gaining access to their fortunes. Dr. Hayes' investigation revealed that Charles Whitmore's marriage to Charlotte Vandermeer represented the culmination of over a year of careful planning and preparation to gain access to one of America's wealthiest families. The wedding itself had been designed not as the beginning of a genuine marriage, but as the completion of an elaborate criminal scheme. Bank records from the Vandermeer families, financial institutions showed that Charles had begun making subtle inquiries about Charlotte's inheritance and trust fund arrangements within weeks of their first meeting. His questions, presented as natural concerns of a prospective husband, had allowed him to gain detailed information about the family's wealth and how it was structured legally. Most significantly, Charles had persuaded William Vandermeer to restructure Charlotte's inheritance to provide her with immediate access to substantial funds upon her marriage. The arrangement, which Charles had suggested as a way to demonstrate his commitment to Charlotte's financial independence, had actually been designed to give him legal access to her wealth as soon as the wedding. The ceremony was completed. The timing of the wedding had been carefully chosen to coincide with a period when William Vandermeer would be traveling extensively on business, leaving Charlotte alone with her new husband for several weeks following their honeymoon. This isolation would provide Charles with the opportunity to complete his criminal plan without immediate family interference. Dr. Hayes discovered that Charles had also made arrangements to liquidate several of Charlotte's assets immediately after the wedding, claiming that he wanted to invest her money in more profitable ventures. The speed with which these transactions had been arranged suggested that Charles had been planning Charlotte's financial exploitation from the beginning of their courtship. Most chilling was evidence that Charles had been making travel arrangements for departure from the United States within days of the wedding, despite his public statements about settling permanently in Newport. Ship passenger manifests showed reservations made under assumed names for departure to South America, where extradition laws would make it difficult for American authorities to pursue him. The wedding portrait that Dr. Hayes had discovered was taken on what Charlotte Vandermeer believed was the happiest day of her life, but was actually the beginning of what Charles Whitmore had planned to be her final weeks of existence. The joyful expression on Charlotte's face served as a tragic contrast to the predatory satisfaction barely concealed behind Charles's smile. 3 weeks after their wedding, Charlotte and Charles Whitmore vanished from their Newport honeymoon cottage, leaving behind a scene that immediately aroused suspicion among local authorities and devastated the Vandermeer family. The circumstances of their disappearance suggested that Charles' criminal plan had finally been set in motion. The cottage, which William Vandermeer had provided for the newlyweds' use during their extended honeymoon, was found by servants in a state of disorder that was completely out of character for Charlotte's normally meticulous housekeeping. Furniture was overturned, personal belongings were scattered throughout the rooms, and there were signs that someone had searched thoroughly through Charlotte's jewelry and personal papers. Most disturbing was the discovery of bloodstains on the bedroom carpet and evidence that significant amounts of blood had been cleaned up, hurriedly but incompletely. The pattern of blood spatter suggested violence had occurred in multiple locations throughout the cottage, indicating a sustained struggle rather than a single incident. Charlotte's extensive jewelry collection, valued at over $100,000, had been completely removed from the cottage. However, several pieces were found discarded in nearby bushes, suggesting that Charles had been interested only in the most valuable and easily portable items rather than sentimental pieces that would be difficult to sell. The most telling evidence was found in Charles's personal belongings, which had been left behind in what appeared to be a hasty departure. Hidden among his clothing, investigators discovered detailed maps of South American ports, travel documents prepared under multiple false identities, and most significantly, correspondence with criminal associates in Boston and New York that referenced completing the Newport job. William Vandermeer's investigation into his daughter's disappearance was more thorough than the local police effort, employing private detectives from Boston and New York who had experience with similar cases. These investigators quickly discovered that Charles Whitmore's background was entirely fabricated, and that similar disappearances had occurred in other cities where he had been active. The bank records revealed that Charlotte's inheritance funds had been transferred to accounts in New York and Boston during the week before her disappearance, using legal documents that bore her signature but showed signs of possible forgery. The money had then been withdrawn in cash, making it virtually impossible to trace. Despite extensive searches of the Newport area and investigation into Charles's possible escape routes, neither Charlotte nor her husband was ever found. The case became one of the most notorious unsolved crimes of the early 1900s, shocking high society families who had previously felt secure in their exclusive social circles. As the investigation into Charlotte Vandermeer's disappearance intensified, law enforcement agencies began connecting Charles Whitmore to a series of similar crimes that had terrorized wealthy communities across the northeastern United States. The discovery of his true criminal identity revealed one of the most sophisticated and deadly con artists in American history. Detective Inspector Thomas Brady of the New York Police Department had been investigating the disappearances of wealthy women for over 3 years when the Whitmore case provided the breakthrough he had been seeking. Brady's analysis of police reports from multiple cities revealed that Charles had been operating under various false identities since at least 1898, systematically targeting and eliminating wealthy women after gaining their trust and access to their fortunes. The real identity of the man, known as Charles Whitmore, was eventually discovered to be Michael Sullivan, a former member of the notorious Hudson River gang that had terrorized New York City during the 1890s. Sullivan had been wanted for multiple murders and had apparently fled New York after a gang war that had decimated his criminal organization. Police records showed that Sullivan had been particularly skilled at assuming false identities and had used his intelligence and education to move beyond street crime into more sophisticated criminal enterprises. His ability to blend into high society had made him far more dangerous than typical criminals, as his victims' families and social circles never suspected that they were dealing with a professional killer. The 3-line scars on Sullivan's hand were confirmed to be identification marks from the Hudson River gang, specifically indicating that he had been responsible for at least 5 successful murders on behalf of the organization. These markings had served as both a badge of accomplishment within the gang and a warning to potential victims, who might recognize their significance. Detective Brady's investigation revealed that Sullivan had been responsible for the deaths of at least 7 wealthy women between 1898 and 1905, using variations of the same methods he had employed with Charlotte Vandermeer. His victims had been carefully selected for their wealth, social isolation, and access to liquid assets that could be quickly converted to cash. The sophisticated nature of Sullivan's crimes had allowed him to evade detection for years, as law enforcement agencies in different cities had not recognized the connections between seemingly unrelated disappearances. His ability to assume convincing false identities had been enhanced by his study of obituaries and public records, allowing him to appropriate the biographies of deceased individuals whose deaths had not been widely reported. Most chilling was the discovery that Sullivan had maintained detailed records of his crimes, including photographs, personal items taken from victims, and financial information about their families. These records, found in a hidden compartment in his New York apartment, provided evidence of a calculating predator who viewed his victims not as human beings but as business opportunities. The revelation of Charles Whitmore's true identity as Michael Sullivan triggered the largest manhunt in the History of American law enforcement up to that point, as authorities across multiple states coordinated efforts to capture one of the country's most dangerous criminals. The case represented a new type of criminal threat that traditional policing methods were ill-equipped to handle. Federal authorities became involved in the investigation. When it was discovered that Sullivan had been transporting stolen property across state lines and had used the postal system to facilitate his various fraud schemes, the newly established Federal Bureau of Investigation assigned their most experienced agents to coordinate the manhunt and develop new techniques for tracking criminals who operated across multiple jurisdictions. The search for Sullivan was complicated by his exceptional skill at creating false identities and his apparent ability to blend seamlessly into wealthy social circles in different cities. Unlike typical criminals who operated in predictable criminal environments, Sullivan had demonstrated that he could successfully impersonate members of high society for extended periods without detection. Detective Brady worked with federal agents to develop the first comprehensive criminal profile of Sullivan's methods and preferences, analyzing patterns in his victim selection, identity creation, and escape strategies. This profile revealed that Sullivan typically spent 6 to 12 months establishing his false identity in a new city before selecting and approaching potential victims. The investigation also revealed Sullivan's extensive network of criminal associates who provided him with forged documents, false references, and assistance in liquidating stolen assets. These associates, primarily located in major cities along the eastern seaboard, had been operating a sophisticated support system for high-level criminal activities that went far beyond typical organized crime. Operations International Law Enforcement agencies were contacted when investigators discovered evidence that Sullivan had been planning to flee to South America, where several other American criminals had successfully evaded extradition. The coordination required to prevent his escape represented one of the first truly international criminal investigations in American history. Despite the massive law enforcement effort, Sullivan's trail went cold after his disappearance from Newport. Several sightings were reported in New York, Boston, and Philadelphia, but none were confirmed. The investigation was further complicated by the discovery that Sullivan had prepared multiple escape identities and had sufficient funds to remain hidden indefinitely. The failure to capture Sullivan highlighted the limitations of early 20th century law enforcement and led to significant reforms in how police agencies shared information and coordinated investigations across jurisdictional boundaries. Michael Sullivan was never captured, despite years of intensive searching by law enforcement agencies across the United States and internationally. The case of Charles Whitmore became a landmark in American criminal history, highlighting both the vulnerability of wealthy society to sophisticated predators and the need for major reforms in law enforcement practices. The impact of Sullivan's crimes extended far beyond his immediate victims, fundamentally changing how America's wealthy families approached marriage and social interaction. The revelation that someone could successfully impersonate a member of high society for over a year led to the development of more sophisticated background investigation services and increased security measures among the social elite. Charlotte Vandermeer's body was never found, though several items of her jewelry were recovered from pawn shops in New York and Boston, confirming that she had been murdered rather than having voluntarily disappeared with her husband. Her father, William Vandermeer, spent the remainder of his life and much of his fortune funding efforts to locate Sullivan and prevent similar crimes. The Vandermeer family's private investigators eventually uncovered evidence suggesting that Sullivan had fled to Argentina, where he may have continued his criminal activities under a new identity. However, communication limitations and lack of extradition agreements made it impossible to confirm his location or arrange for his return to face justice. The wedding portrait that Dr. Hayes had discovered became a crucial piece of evidence in understanding Sullivan's methods and psychology, providing insights into how he had maintained his deception even during intimate family moments. The photograph was used in training programs for law enforcement, agencies and private security services that specialized in protecting wealthy families. The case led to significant reforms in law enforcement coordination, including the establishment of the first national criminal database and improved communication systems between police departments in different cities. These changes, while too late to help Sullivan's victims, helped prevent similar crimes and improve the capture rate for criminals operating across state lines. Modern forensic analysis of the wedding photograph, using techniques unavailable in 1905, has provided additional insights into Sullivan's identity and methods. The scarring pattern on his hand has been definitively linked to the Hudson River Gang, and facial recognition technology has been used to connect him to several other unsolved crimes from the period. The story of Charlotte Vandermeer and Michael Sullivan serves as a reminder that even the most privileged and protected members of society are vulnerable to predators who possess sufficient intelligence, patience, and ruthlessness. The wedding portrait that captured what appeared to be perfect happiness actually documented the moment when one of America's most dangerous criminals achieved his greatest deception. Today, The photograph remains in the Newport Historical Society's collection as a testament to the importance of vigilance and the reality that evil can hide behind even the most convincing facades. The scars on Michael Sullivan's hand, barely visible in the original photograph, but now enhanced through digital technology, continue to tell their story of violence and deception more than a century after they were first captured on film. The case file remains open, and law enforcement agencies continue to receive occasional tips about possible Sullivan sightings, though none have been verified. Charlotte Vandermeer's disappearance remains one of America's most notorious unsolved crimes. And the wedding portrait that should have commemorated the beginning of her married life instead serves as evidence in one of the most chilling criminal cases in American history,